So I know, like, in reflecting for myself, a question I always ask is what would play look like in this situation? I find if something feels a bit heavy, that's something that always anchors me back to, right, that's probably the missing ingredient, or what would taking myself a little less seriously look like here? What does it feel like for you when you don't have that creativity piece into it, and how does that play out?
Well, one of the things that is important in that space is to give yourself some motivation to do something that you might not. So, and it really is about, okay, I'm going to allocate this time, and at the end of it, I'm going to give myself a reward when I've done it. So I'm going to knock this over, and then I'm going to go and do that, whatever that might be. Whether it's that I go and hit a golf ball, or I go and have a beer, or have a cup of coffee, or I go for a walk, whatever it is. But I decide that there's that reward, and that's my motivation to get the job done.
Maybe to play the devil's advocate a little bit, knowing that both you and I have almost complete control over time because of the nature of the work we do. I think a lot of people don't feel like that within their work, and particularly with businesses. I hear a lot where owners get to the point where they've got 5+ team members, I think is a really common point for it, where that shift sort of happens where it's it's really apparent that you can no longer be the technician. You need to be the manager, the overseer. The weight gets on. A really common theme I see is that burden of feeding the hungry beast. And with that goes flexibility a lot of the time. What are some ways you would look at with businesses like that to be able to exercise strengths?
It's a bit about recrafting jobs, and the way, that there's a person who comes in and they do X, Y, and Z. That's their job. That's what they're paid to do. But they've got this other set of experiences in life. They've got these other strengths that may not necessarily be heavily utilised in that job that can add value if you tap into them. So job crafting, I suppose, around the whole person, rather than just looking at, we need to fit you into that hole.
Yeah, I love it. If I could play with that a little bit, this has come up a few times in client situations recently, and the way I would describe this phenomena and the problem that exists is that you go and put a new PD together, and something is defined, and it feels great, and everyone's in alignment, and then the minute it goes on paper, there's this drift that happens because small business is dynamic and it changes. Where do you start with job crafting? So to describe the problem, you've got someone who's in the business who is what I would call culturally a good fit. There's someone that the team gets along with well, they want to work well, but maybe they're not in the position that's most suited for them. Where do you start with that?
And I started from the perspective of what are the things that are important in a work experience for people. And I came up with 5 things. So the first one was roles. So, everybody's got a job to do, and everybody might have a secondary role, maybe as a leader or a first aid attendant or whatever. So that's the first thing. So we need to understand what is required to do that job well, what skills and attributes, etc., go with that, and what sort of performance outcomes we're looking for. The second was about relationships, and that really comes down to internal customer and supplier arrangements. So who do I rely on for stuff, and who relies on me for stuff, and how well is that working? The third bit was around organisational values and my behaviours. So am I actually walking the talk with the way we want to do stuff here, and the way we interact with each other, and the way we present internally and external? And often organisations struggle a bit with consistency between the external and the internal, and it's really important that they align. The fourth is strengths. So that opportunity to use strengths, and I use something called the VIA Character Strength Survey as the instrument for that. And that's really about looking at how do we give people the opportunity to utilise their strengths, and how do we support them in areas where they might not be so strong. And then the fifth is well-being. So it's very much a part of the conversation, and I came up with this 6 or 7 years ago, this model, and now it's really relevant with the psychosocial hazard stuff coming in. So in essence, how it works, the first is positioning someone. So it's doing a stock take. Where does this person sit in these 5 lenses? The second bit is about putting a plan together. And it's a simple action plan is what's the issue? How are we going to deal with it? Who's going to be involved? And what's the KPI or the metric or the timeline? Then it's perform. So the employee is responsible for their own performance and development. The manager's job is to coach them and support them in that. And so the employee takes on their plan and they have regular catch-ups, and I suggest at least monthly, where there's a conversation. The manager really just has to ask a few simple questions every month. The first is, what's worked well? Let's high five, celebrate the good stuff. And the second is, what's not gone to plan for whatever reason. The third is, what's changed? So because change is constant. There's a new system, or there's a new customer, or there's a new team member, or whatever. But there's something new that we need to address. What have we learned from all that? And what are we going to do about it? And then the plan is adjusted accordingly. So it sort of becomes it provides clarity around the position description as it looks at that point in time, that this is what the job is, and these are the priorities. So it helps to confirm priorities, it helps to identify support needs, and it helps to measure performance, as a result. And because you're having these regular conversations, you can pivot if things are not going to plan and address things. I think, in a sense, we've heard the term performance improvement plan before, which lawyers will tell you put somebody on a performance improvement plan when they're not performing, which I reckon is a bit late. I think everybody should be on a performance plan from day one. And then if you need to overlay it with some consequences, then you do that. But we don't need to go and telling people that they're in the naughty corner with a performance improvement plan. It just, to me, it doesn't make sense. So that's the process, quite simply. And if organisations can develop their managers to be coaches, and Jake, you would know that Gallup and plenty of other organisations advocate that this is the best way to go if you want to develop high-performing teams. So it's just picking up on that as well, but simplifying it for small businesses so that there's a bit of time setting it up with the stock take you've got to do up front, but then it should be no longer than a 15 to 30-minute conversation every month.
I'm in total agreement. I always think it's one of the most impactful things is, like, as a toolkit piece, literally giving, because I think a lot of leaders don't do this because they feel like they need to have the answers, but that's thinking about the situation in the wrong way. So, early as you move through an organisation, typically you get promoted because you do know the answers, you're good at performing. But again, that necessary point comes when your job becomes creating the environment for performance, not driving the performance, because that can't scale. For that reason, I think alleviating it, changing that perspective, and actually giving them that toolkit. And I was smiling before because I've nearly come to exactly the same format with the questions. It's effectively, what do you feel is working? What do you feel is not working? Probably the only point I differ with one of the baseline questions is there a role as your manager, leader, whatever, I can play in supporting that? And the beautiful thing about it is it creates ownership, because it's what they're focused on. It's their own words, it's their own commitments. It's ownership is the word. It's something you then own as a team member. Which is an incredibly powerful thing, because as well, it builds agency, which I think is an absolute precursor for high performance. You have to feel like you can make a difference. Again, it's a precursor for belonging. If you don't feel like you can make a difference, what am I even doing here?